Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Ives with the National Weather Service in Kansas City, Missouri. I would like to welcome you today to the Midwest and Great Plains Climate Drought Outlook for this 17th of April, 2014. Our presenter today will be Dr. Dennis Toddy, state climatologist for the state of South Dakota and also at the South Dakota State University. So without further ado, Dennis, it's all yours.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the introduction. And I am from the South Dakota State University, as John said, so like our friends from the Ohio State University. Welcome to everybody on a pretty Thursday afternoon here in South Dakota, eliminating our couple inches of snow that we picked up yesterday. So let's get right at this. We have a great deal to talk about, lots of things happening that are longer term and shorter term in effort right now. So let's go ahead and move on to, there we go. Just a reminder, this is a general activity, a collaborative activity among several federal and state partners involving the regional climate centers, state climatologists, NOAA, USDA, and a number of other partners along the way that unfortunately I'll probably forget to mention some of the National Drought Mitigation Center. Our next, just a reminder, our next webinar will be May 15th. It is our regular one. Our presenter is to be determined, but there will be an intervening one, an interim one on May 1st that will deal with Missouri River specifically. We'll talk a bit about that today, and we'll do an update on the Missouri River specifically in 2 weeks. Because of the heavy snowpack and watching the potential for flood issues there. You can sign up, just a reminder of where to sign up for these on drought.gov, and archive versions of the slides and the webinars are available at the High Plains and Midwestern Regional Climate Center. All right, our agenda for today, we'll review some current conditions, historic and current conditions, over the last several months and to get us to where we are right now. Then we'll break up into several impacts regions because there are some specific impacts dealing with certain areas in the Great Plains and Central region. We'll deal with those individually. And we'll just do some general spring ag. We're starting to get into the main ag part, the planting season, talk a little bit about that. Outlooks, and our usual outlooks, and then address El Nino a little bit, which has picked up a lot of publicity in the media and in NOAA over the last couple months because of some quick changes that we are seeing in Pacific sea surface temperatures. Okay, moving on to our current situation, kind of a review of the last several months and where we are currently. Looking back at March, statewide rankings for temperatures around the U.S., the lighter blue areas to darker blue areas being below average, and then the specific ranking. You can see throughout the eastern part of the central region or the Corn Belt running below average, running in the teens to low 20s in ranking for cold temperatures during the month of March. Great Lakes even running in single digits coldest for the last 120 years. But as you progress westward, the Great Plains states running closer to average, and then the western edge of our area running above average. So indicating this continuation of a ridge trough pattern we've talked about in previous ones, where we have a larger ridge of high pressure over the western U.S. You can imagine kind of a bubble of high pressure that has been deflecting the jets into Canada over much of the last month and throughout good portions of the last year, which has helped to lead to the California drought issues. We'll not dive into those too much. And then a dipping down of that out of Canada, a trough over much of the eastern U.S., where that colder air is funneling down into the states, leading to the colder than average temperatures and continuation of some of the wintertime conditions. Been very persistent throughout March, throughout the winter, and even some last year. Looking back at March precipitation, you can see kind of a different picture we're looking at as we look just to our northwest. In the northwest and Montana and Wyoming, you'll see much above average precipitation. You see the 118 in Montana being the 118th wettest March out of 120 years. We'll talk about some of the impacts of that here in a little bit. But in large contrast, in the central part of the Corn Belt there, you see top 10 driest Marches on record. March is not a huge precipitation time in our hydrologic scale, but it is when a month when we start seeing additional precipitation. So the lack of precipitation is starting to show up in some of the impacts that we're seeing around us. And then surrounding the central part of the Corn Belt, you see relatively low precipitation rankings for the month of March. And let's see, let's move on then. I've included the last 3 months picture, temperatures in the upper left-hand side and precipitation in the lower right-hand side with a very similar pattern that you're seeing. Temperature ranks for January through March on the left-hand side, much colder, top 10 coldest January through March on record throughout, basically along and east of the Mississippi River. Very warm to our west. From a precipitation standpoint, everybody being, again, still fairly dry compared to areas of Montana and Wyoming. We're running much above average in the way of precipitation out in that area. Those southern areas, take note of the top 10 driest areas from Nebraska, Missouri on down in Oklahoma are setting up for some impacts we'll talk about in the way of winter wheat as we go along in this session. Looking back to over the water year, going back to October 1st, we use water year from a water standpoint. It also works from an agricultural standpoint as looking at the soil moisture recharge time over that time since October 1st. So the percent of normal in the upper left-hand side and the departure from normal lower right-hand side across the middle part of the country, you see the purple in the areas of Montana, Wyoming, and the western Dakotas running 150 to 200% of average, almost double fall precipitation, partially from the winter or the fall blizzard that occurred in early October, as well as some additional heavy rainfalls have impacted the mountain areas out there in the way of snowpack, also soil moisture, which we'll talk about as we go along. Give you an idea of what that means from a departure from average precipitation, looking at 3 to 6 or in some places more than 6 inches above average precipitation in that area. In contrast, you see in the Central Plains there, Nebraska, Kansas, and over to Iowa, Missouri, and parts of Illinois, very dry during this time period, 50 to 70% of average or below 50% in certain of those places, indicating some of the lack of precipitation that is leading to some dryness issues and drought, which we'll talk about when we get to the drought monitor map. Now looking at a shorter time period, last 30 days, just looking at overall temperatures, average temperatures in the upper left-hand side, again, looking from Montana down to Kentucky, and then the departure from average in the lower right-hand side. Basically, in the far southwest part of the area, Colorado, parts of Wyoming, closer to average, a few areas slightly above average in the way of temperatures. The northern tier along Canada running much below average in the way of temperatures, 4 to as much as 8 degrees below average over the last 30 days. So that has slowed a number of things. Still melting out some snow in some northern areas we'll talk about here in just a minute, and slowed agricultural activity, even has kept some soils from thawing out until this point. So speaking of snow cover, now we'll look at the no-risk map from NOAA. If we can get my slide to advance here. There we go. This is current snow cover and snow depth on the right-hand side. On the left, the areas of Colorado and Wyoming are obviously the mountain areas. We'll talk about some of the snowpack there in just a little bit. This most recent event over the last couple days has dropped, again, several inches of snowfall from eastern South Dakota into central Minnesota, which will probably be gone again relatively quickly. But there are areas of northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and northern Michigan that are still carrying a decent snowpack at this point, associated with a decent snowpack accumulated during the winter, overall cold temperatures, and adjacent very cold temperatures from the Great Lakes, which is keeping that snowpack from disappearing quite as quickly. But generally, we have eliminated most of the snowpack throughout the plains areas. This will not be impacting in any flooding from a major standpoint. It will just be adding some runoff to rivers. We'll talk about it a little bit again here also. Related to this also, in the cold temperatures we have seen some very anomalous frost depths. We talked about those in some sessions over the winter time, with developing some very deep frost depths throughout the winter because of the overall cold temperatures, the length of cold temperatures starting from right after Thanksgiving all the way through the end of March, and varying amounts of snowpack in certain areas developed frosts into very deep depths. On the left-hand side, you can see the depth of frost penetration in the Missouri River Basin. National Weather Service offices mainly are where these are done. The 18 over Sioux Falls, Harry Hilliker just noted a little bit ago that has now been removed, that they're not reporting any frost depth at this point. Aberdeen, as of Monday, they were reporting 41 inches, probably has reduced a little bit. And Williston, North Dakota, reporting 57 inches of frost depth still. Still a little bit hard to believe, but carrying a decent amount of frost depth at this time. Over on the Mississippi River north central area, you can see here into Minnesota, parts of northern Wisconsin. You can see the scale here. Some places still carrying 8 to 20 inches of depth, and some more, even 20 to 40 inches in certain areas. So we still have a ways to go to eliminate some of this frost depth penetration. Iowa has largely reduced most of theirs due to some warmer temperatures and rainfalls over the weekend. That's probably what we're going to need in some cases, is a little bit of rainfall falling on this, because generally soil temperatures are near freezing at worst, and a little bit of moisture would probably help to remove the frost to the ground at greater depth. So we'll continue watching this. This will probably continue making good progress, especially in the next week, as we're looking at warmer temperatures headed to the area. Speaking of soil moisture also, this is the NLDAS soil moisture models. This is an ensemble of soil moisture models indicating departures from average or soil moisture anomalies. This, again, is in millimeters, so take note of that. You have to divide by 25 to get inches. Indicating the general perspective, we are seeing that the area we talked about in the northern plains, the Dakotas to Montana and Wyoming, still much wetter than average carryover from last fall. In the central part of the region, central part of the Corn Belt, some fairly dry soils overall that were dry last summer and had little recovery last fall, that have not to this point. Jim Angel sent me a note a bit ago checking the date on this, that these soil moisture models had not incorporated the heavier rains over the weekend. Some of the models had, some had not. So these have not completely incorporated the several inches of rainfall we'll show here in just a little bit, that have improved conditions somewhat from a soil moisture standpoint. And then looking in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, Indiana, parts of Ohio, even a little bit of Michigan, and we'll talk about that in some of the ag reports, running somewhat wetter than average, where recent precipitation has made things wetter and has slowed some activity in those areas. So all related into what we're dealing with in the way of drought conditions and what we're looking at in the way of planting activity. Our current U.S. drought monitor map for the north-central part of the U.S., scale again, yellow D0 to D3 is the most we have in this area. So those wetter areas, largely no drought conditions involved. That central part of the Corn Belt from southern Minnesota down to parts of Missouri, carrying D0, D1, moderate drought. We've still not been able to get rid of that. A little pocket of D2 in parts of Iowa. And then you see as you get down in Nebraska and Kansas, we have still lots of carryover issues down in this area with D2 and D3. For those of you that are not on the drought monitor list or have not seen, there are pictures coming out of parts of Colorado, parts of Kansas and Oklahoma, that if you change how the houses looked and change the cars, you would swear it was Dust Bowl. We do have conditions down there because of about 4 years now of well below average precipitation, really producing conditions that look like dust bowl in the way of blowing dust. And these are not off mismanaged lands. These are some cases well-managed lands where basically they've run out of moisture. So lots of carryover problems in that area. Most of the main part of the Corn Belt area, Northern Plains, we are drought-free at this point. Okay, so that gives you kind of a current status of things in the way of recent moisture, soil moisture, temperatures, frozen soils, that situation. So now we're going to look at some of the impact areas and look at some of the issues related to some of those. First one we're going to deal with is the Great Lakes area, which is a little bit different one for us, but does fall in part of our area. An odd situation with, well, not odd given the soil or given the overall temperatures, but the Great Lakes are still 40.6%, a little over 40% frozen, down from their peak of just over 92%, which was the highest since 1979. What that has done, it has had a couple impacts. It has slowed the start of the shipping season. Some steel mills in the Southern Lakes, which require iron ore from Minnesota and Wisconsin, they have not been able to start shipping those yet. The Port of Green Bay is reporting no ships. Usually they have their first one by about April 3rd, so running a couple weeks behind there, which has caused a transportation issue where they're having to transport by truck or train or delaying shipping because of the inability to transit the lakes at this point. They're expecting things to pick up here fairly soon, but still have a little bit of ice they have to get rid of. The additional ice has also helped, along with the additional rainfall, has helped the Great Lakes recover. They're getting additional runoff from the snow and the recent rains, plus the limited winter evaporation, because of them being frozen over, has reduced any wintertime evaporation loss. We'll bring up a slide here showing our Great Lakes levels. The lakes here, Superior, Huron, Michigan, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie in Ontario. What is shown here is January through December. The red line is where we were in 2013. The gray is the gray dots are the long-term average, and then the blue line is where we are in 2014. So you can see in almost all the lakes, 2014 is running except for Michigan and Huron. All the lakes are running close to their long-term averages. Lake Michigan, Huron is running a bit below at this point. So compared to where we were a couple years ago, we've seen recovery in the lakes. Helping those out, as I mentioned, we've had 7-day average stream flows here, indicating where the heavier precipitation has been and where we're getting some of those higher stream flows. This incorporates some things we're going to talk about in the future here too. You see areas of Wisconsin and Michigan with some higher stream flows, some above the 90th percentile, some running highest on record because of some recent rainfall and falling on some frozen soils in those areas. You see some of those eastern areas of the Corn Belt with fairly high stream flows, parts of Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, and down into the central to southern plains with the below average stream flows where we are at this point. Okay, moving on to the wheat belt, impacts of the wheat belt. For those of you that were not quite aware, the cold temperatures early this week has had some fairly, we think, fairly significant impacts on top of some other ones in the wheat belt. Just to get a little background on where we are, the red areas here are the winter wheat areas, and then, the green areas are the minor winter wheat areas, the darker green, the major growing winter wheat areas, and this is the current drought monitor overlaying on top of this. So those areas we pointed out, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, drought conditions impacting winter wheat in those areas. So we've had some, the reports on winter wheat were not very good to begin with because of the overall dry conditions from the winter. Some winter kill probably because of colder temperatures during the winter. So that set us up for the event earlier this week. This is a map from USDA World Agricultural Outlook Board. Brad Rippey provided this morning. These are the minimum temperatures on April 14 and 15 throughout the middle part of the country. So you see the northern areas of our area here fell into the teens, some single digits in South Dakota and parts of Montana. While cold for this time of year, not much of a problem because the overall cold temperatures have not allowed much activity to occur. But as you're getting down into the central and southern plains, this is a problem because winter wheat had broken dormancy, was starting to grow, tillering, and even in certain places reached jointed stage where its cold tolerance is greatly reduced. So the work is going on assessing the impacts right now. The overall assessment on the winter wheat seems to be Nebraska and South Dakota. Probably the cold was still early enough. Winter wheat had not broken dormancy enough to be a problem. Kansas, the teens, they're still assessing. May not be too bad a situation, but there probably was some damage. And then Oklahoma was not quite as cold, but their winter wheat was farther along, so there's expected to be some damage reported there. So the cold temperatures on top of the drought conditions probably will do some damage to overall winter wheat yields down in these areas. The overall cold temperatures also had some other issues on alfalfa, where alfalfa had started to grow, especially when it reached 6-inch stage. That was probably enough to start doing some damage to alfalfa. Other places may not have been quite as much damage. Just a little bit at the winter wheat condition. On the left, these are both also from USDA World Agricultural Outlook Board NASS data. On the left-hand side, these are winter wheat condition index for the whole U.S., the various years from 1995 to 2014. The red line here is where we are in 2013, 2014. You can see on the bottom, well into the bottom 5 or so worst conditions the last 20 years. And on the left-hand side, indicating the biggest change from fall to spring and winter wheat condition, 2013, 2014 rivaled 95, 96 in the drop in overall winter wheat condition. A number of other years there have been other drops, but this is one of the bigger years where our winter wheat condition really fell off, again, because of overall cold temperatures and drought conditions really harming winter wheat. So the additional cold temperatures they had early this week were not ones that we needed to have happen at this point. Moving on to our next area, we're going to address the Missouri River and some overall flooding issues. First slide we're going to show here is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Their assessment of the overall snowpack and inches of water equivalent available. The left-hand figure is above Fort Peck. Right-hand side is from Fort Peck to Garrison. The red line is the 30-year average, and then the blue shaded line is where we are this year, and you can see that it's tracking very closely along with this other blue line, which was 2011, which has introduced some concern along the Missouri River because of the heavy snowpack. We've been dealing more with that on some of the Missouri River Basin states. There are a number of other different issues going on right now than we had back in 2011, but we are watching this very closely at this point. Leading to this, these are NRCS maps, USDA NRCS. On the upper left-hand side, various river basins and their percent of average. And you can see all the river basins in Montana, Wyoming on the right-hand side, and most of Colorado are running above average, and a large portion of them running 120 to 150% of average this year. So we've had a very good snow year, so we are going to be producing good runoff. This will likely cause some flooding in local areas during the melt-off. We don't think it's going to cause a large issue on the Missouri River Basin as a whole. So this is going to lead into the Missouri. Also, the Platte is expecting to get some good runoff that will help out the Platte area. All right, now we'll turn it over to Kevin Lau from the Missouri River Basin Forecast Center. He'll talk about some generalized Missouri River Basin flood issues.
Thank you, Dennis. This is Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Just wanted to give a couple of comments on the flood potential. As Dennis has already went over, we do have a well above average snowpack. The volumes coming off of that mountain snowpack, the April water supply forecast put out by the Natural Resources Conservation Service in collaboration with the Weather Service indicates anywhere from about 120% to 150% of average, depending on what basin you're in. So we are looking at better than average volumes coming off the snowmelt, but that does not necessarily translate into significant flooding. In fact, with the graphic that Dennis has up right now, the National Weather Service continues with their projections that we don't expect significant flooding in the mountains due to mountain melt-off alone. Right now, our projections show that we do have a likelihood of minor flooding in Montana, in the Big Hole Basin and the Gallatin Basins, also in Wyoming, in the North Platte and Laramie River Basins. As far as plains flood potential goes, we are looking with some caution, if you will, at the northern plains, especially central and western Dakotas. As Dennis has already alluded to, the soils are quite wet. The plain snowpack is insignificant, but the soils are still wet, and we did have some flooding in a few places in North Dakota a couple of weeks ago, and so we're still keeping an eye on it. However, again, the National Weather Service is not projecting even a 50% chance of flooding in the Dakotas, but some places are fairly close to that 50%. And then in the lower portion of the basin in Missouri and southern Iowa and extreme eastern Kansas, thunderstorm activity almost always brings us to minor to moderate flooding. We've already experienced that in the past few weeks in the state of Missouri, and we will likely continue to experience local flooding in the lower third of the basin due to this convective activity that springtime typically brings. So overall, take-home point is even though we do have a well above average snowpack in the mountains, at this time we are not indicating a probability for significant flooding from that snowmelt. I'll turn it back to you, Dennis.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Just to mention a couple other areas in our region, the Red River, which is typically a problem area. The flood peak has abated there. On the the Mississippi River, we are seeing some minor flooding at this point by some snowmelt and runoff from Wisconsin, but that is not expected to be too much of a problem because of relatively dry conditions just to the west of it. And we're also seeing some higher flows out further to the east, as I showed earlier, but generally no major problems at this point. Okay, looking at spring ag activity, we are a little bit early in the spring for some situations, but activity is starting to progress, so there is concerns related here. So we've looked early at frost depths, now looking at 4-inch soil moisture or soil temperatures. The area in the plains with soils being closer to where corn could be planted in the southern part of the region. North Dakota is still running temperatures right at or just above freezing, so we are that's being slowing ag activity there. On the right-hand side, 4-inch soil temperatures from the Midwest Climate Center, going from again 50s in the southern part of the area up to again the low 30s in the northern part of the area. So generally keeping that and the cold temperatures keeping too much ag activity going on. There was, as I alluded to earlier, some changes, some heavier precipitation, which has improved conditions with heavier rain from eastern Iowa through Wisconsin and Michigan in the last week. I mentioned that in the way of impacting soil moisture, also helping take some frost out of the ground where we had up to 3 to 4 inches of precipitation over the last 7 days, which is, and in Iowa particularly helped improve situations in parts of Illinois where the soils were relatively dry. Other parts of the region, light precipitation over the last week. From a planting progress standpoint, again, relatively early in northern parts of the region, the Corn Belt area, we've just passed crop insurance dates within the last week, so would not expect much activity to this point anyway. but still not a lot in the way of corn planting activity. I'll show you a graphic here in just a second. We have corn progress. Most of what has happened has been small grains, oats planted. This third column here is where we are at this point, 16% in South Dakota, 28% in Nebraska, 29% in Iowa. These are not big acreage, by the way, but there is activity going on that way. Some spring wheat being planted, 6% in South Dakota, 3% in Montana. So that's about the small grains, the main activity going on. Also some field work activity that is starting out. From a corn planting perspective, the top number is the percent of corn planted. This, again, is from USDA NASS. With Kansas, 11% planted, 9% in Missouri, 4% in Kentucky, just small amounts, 1% in Illinois, and then the northern part of the Corn Belt, really nothing moving in the way of corn. Cold soils and cold temperatures have kept people from doing too much field work that way. So kind of a summary of what we're seeing in the way of agricultural issues. Soil temperature is limiting. Soil moisture being dry in the western part of the area. Not a problem at this point, but we'll need some additional precipitation once planting occurs. Actually, conditions I mentioned in the way of soil moisture, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and even parts of Wisconsin, their weekly NASS report indicated above, some wet fields being a problem for slowing down field activity at this point. In the way of planting progress, it's been slowed. We're still early, but this will be a time where people will start wanting to get things going. Some small grain activity, a little bit of corn in the southern corn belts, Iowa even reporting a little bit in their southern areas. Mostly it's been field work, tillage, fertilizer applications, nitrogen applications, some things that can go on before seed goes in the ground. Kind of an offshoot of this, livestock losses have been reported in most of the livestock areas as near to below average, which is a fortunate thing after the huge fall losses we saw with the blizzard. The lack of losses with young livestock has been beneficial to those areas. Some overall concerns on winter freeze damage and winter wheat. As we start breaking dormancy in further north areas, we'll start finding out how much damage there was. Even in Michigan, despite the lack of dormancy break, there is concern and reports coming from some winter freeze damage to horticultural crops, trees, shrubs, that sort of thing in Michigan. Okay, moving on to outlooks now, what we're doing in the way of outlooks. 7-day precip, the whole suite out to 3 months, seasonal drought outlooks, and we will talk about El Nino. Okay, first map is our total precipitation forecast from the Hydrological Prediction Center as part of NOAA. Largely better chances for precipitation throughout the central part of our region here. A little less to the west, a little bit less into the plains. Northern plains, you can see decent amounts forecast. As we get into next week, there looks to be a fairly decent-sized system going to be producing heavier precipitation somewhere in the area. It's been waffling around in the models as to how much and where that precipitation is going to be, but it looks like there will be some decent precipitation. Also, as you get into next week, some southerly flow is going to be coming over the area, warming temperatures back up, which will start spurring more ag activity also. Looking at the 8 to 14-day outlook, these are from yesterday. The 8 to 14-day outlook for temperature on the left-hand side, much of the area indicating above average chances for temperatures, for above average temperatures, again with that southerly flow going on. The area along the Canadian border with some of the wetter soils and some of the snow up there probably helping hold on to some of the warmer temperatures in that region. You see on the right-hand side, probabilities for precipitation throughout most of the area are above average in the way of precipitation. So we will be getting into a bit more of an active pattern. Exactly who gets it, we'll have to find out, but there is a bit more activity expected to happen. The new May outlooks just released today for the month of May. The northern tier likely staying on the cool side, mountain snowpack, wet soils, and then the overall cold Great Lakes are likely to be influencing temperatures in this area. There's even been discussion around the Great Lakes of this impacting temperatures into the early part of summer because of the overall cold lake situation. And and then only the far southern areas indicating better chances for above average temperatures. Most everybody else running in the EC equal chances. From a precipitation standpoint, the forecasters were looking at various tools and various models, and they were all over the board. There was very little consistency among them as to what is expected for precipitation, which as we get into the convective time of year is to be expected. So no real leanings in the way of precipitation. Moving on to the 3-month outlook, May through July, you see a somewhat similar pattern with that cold bubble still being held onto in Montana and North Dakota. They do remove the cold overall in the Great Lakes. The forecaster must not have thought the Great Lake influence would be sufficient through the whole period. From a precipitation standpoint, you see the only precipitation, this was consistent among a number of models, was developing a monsoonal type flow in the Four Corners area, catching the southwestern part of our area, with likely increased chances for precipitation as we get into the mid-late part of summer. The rest of the basin, the rest of the region, no real indications on the way of precipitation. What that means for us on the drought outlook, this is the seasonal drought outlook, which continues through the latter part of July. Really the only thing they're hanging their hat on at this point is this kind of greenish area indicating drought removal likely. Basically what they're saying is that drought conditions are D1. Removing one category of drought from D1 would indicate drought removal. And as we get into the latter part of spring, precipitation does exceed crop water use, evapotranspiration. Therefore, it's likely to improve conditions. Central part of the plains, drought remains but improves. Maybe some improvement there, but the drought is strong enough, entrenched enough not to remove it. And then the darker brown areas indicating drought persisting. Maybe not intensifying anymore, but certainly persisting. Now, the other factor that, as I mentioned, has received a lot of publicity, it had been existing in some of the models, at least for discussion, but has really ramped up over the last month or so because of a big change that has been occurring in the equatorial Pacific, is what's happening with El Nino. On the right-hand side, you see the current status of sea surface temperatures here at the top, and then the departures from average sea surface temperatures at the bottom. And you see a little bit of a warm pool, 1 degree C in around the date line, a little bit just to our east, but the surface feature is not really showing what's really going on. On the left-hand side, you see the plume of warm water that was just below the surface that has gradually been reaching the surface in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, progressing from near the date lines, that area over near South America, and a very impressive, very strong pool of warm water that is probably going to be kicking off El Nino conditions. Just a matter of the timing, it looks more like at this point, rather than whether it is or not. It looks much more likely, just a matter of what time it is. A number of people who've been watching this have been remarking about how strong that is, 5-6 degrees C anomaly in the way of sea surface temperatures is very large in the equatorial Pacific. So what the outlook, what we have for ENSO, for El Nino conditions, El Nino conditions look likely sometime during the late summer, fall. What we're showing you here is the probabilities of the three phases: red probability of El Nino, green neutral, and blue La Nina conditions during our 3-month time frames looking ahead. AMJ is April, May, June, July, August, July, August, September. And you see as we go from May, June, July to June, July, August, that El Nino becomes more likely than neutral conditions do. And then as we go into the fall and particularly winter, this will be an even bigger issue to talk about as we go along into the Northern Hemisphere winter. So it looks like by sometime during the summertime we have a good likelihood of El Nino impacting us. What that generally means, and it has been incorporated a little bit into the outlooks, generally what we look for in the way of El Nino conditions is generally overall good growing seasons. May not be outstanding, but they tend not to be bad growing seasons. From a temperature standpoint, you would lean near to maybe a little bit below average temperatures throughout the basin and near to maybe a little bit above average in the way of precipitation. There will be variabilities in where that is, but generally over the Corn Belt, that's what you expect to see during an El Nino summer. So we'll watch that as we go along through our next outlooks. So kind of a summary here of what we've seen, trying to bring together a whole bunch of pieces. We've thrown a lot at you in the time period here. Generally been cooler in the 30-day, but more recently we've been warm, and we'll be getting warm into next week. The late freeze has caused an issue, again, with alfalfa and winter wheat specifically. Slow start to ag activity, and then the impact on winter wheat. Soil still generally cool, some still frozen in our northern areas. Soil moisture higher to the northwest and to the east, and dry from the central Corn Belt down to the southwest. We are continuing monitoring Missouri and several tributaries for flooding. There will likely be some along the way and some occurring right now, but right now I don't expect any major issues with that. Great Lakes frozen, recovering their levels, and has had an impact on commerce. As we go along from an outlook standpoint, we're going to be transitioning from ENSO neutral conditions to El Nino into the summer, and for sure it looks pretty likely by fall to happen. Cooler conditions are the most likely in the Northern Plains, Great Lakes area into May, and cooler conditions indicated or most likely in the Montana, North Dakota area. The probabilities are not terribly strong, but if you had to lean, that's the way to lean right now. The only wet area is more likely is down in Colorado. Drought conditions in the southern and western parts of the area. Slight improvement is likely. The drought conditions are likely to stay on the south and west. Some spring flood potential in the convective and snow-melt areas. We're going to continue to monitor Missouri, and because of good runoff from all the mountain areas. Okay, just a reminder of all of our partners here that we've talked about already. Tried to bring them in along the way. And we can now open it up for any questions that you have. Kevin Lau is also available from a flood perspective. Kevin Stamm from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is available. And other state climatologists may be able to chime in as needed. So what questions do you have at this point?
Okay, the lines are open. Well, Dennis, it sounds like everyone understood what you had to say.
I do apologize for the length of this. We've gone longer than we usually like to with the presentation. Unfortunately, as we were putting pieces together, it became very apparent that there were a number of different things we wanted to bring on board. So are there any questions that people have thought of along the way, or any other of the partners have any additional comments they would like to add here at the end?
Excuse me, may I ask a question?
Go ahead, Bryce.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Dennis, good to hear you again on the presentation. Could I get a little bit more of a feel on some approximate time during the summer with El Nino development that you would say things would be developing to the point that there would indeed be an El Nino stamp, so to speak, on what's going on weather-wise?
June 9th.
Do you want me to take that, Dennis?
I would say the likelihood increases as summer goes along, so that our biggest time period where we would have an impact on yield would be if things were happening by July and August, in the way of especially corn yield, reducing stress on corn yield, and soybeans as we get into August. The likelihood seems to indicate that there will be some kind of an El Nino signal by that point that would start having an influence on yields around our area. John, if you want to comment, or if anybody else wants to comment, I would be happy to defer at this point.
I just want to point out kind of how we go about determining whether we'll have an El Nino or not. And it's basically this little area here that's kind of, it looks like it's yellow and red. And this is where we look for temperatures to be like a half degree Celsius above normal. So that's kind of what we have to look at. It has to last for about at least a good 5-month period on average. So
are we into that time frame yet, John?
No, we are not yet. We sure are not.
Huh?
Yeah, we haven't reached quite that warmth yet.
One of the reasons I was interested, besides the row crops, was that if I understand correctly, it sounds like El Nino influence might be really too late for winter wheat in the southern plains, along with, the pasture situation in that part of the country also. What do you think about that, at least for this year?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Bryce, that while El Nino looks like it's progressing well, I don't think it's going to come in enough time to impact winter wheat. The impact that's not addressed here, but there has been discussion about, okay, would the El Nino be strong enough to have an impact that it could help alleviate some of the drought conditions in California? That is a distinct possibility, but would not be happening probably until fall, winter more specifically. So we'll be watching it more closely at that point.
Thank you.
And just to follow on with what Dennis said, even once we get into more of a full-blown El Nino, there is also a lagged response by the atmosphere. So once we get into it, it does take time for things to adjust and the effects to be felt.
Are there any other questions?
This is Nancy at the World Herald. I didn't hear who it was that said that El Nino might reduce corn stress in July and August if it materializes and is a little cooler than normal. I think that's what I understood the person to say. I didn't hear who that was.
Yeah, that was me. That was Dennis.
Okay, thanks, Dennis.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not a guarantee, but work we've done previously indicates that if you're in an El Nino situation during the summertime, that's a way I would lean at this point.
Okay, thank you.
This is Mary. I have a question. Do you know of any scheduled training workshops that in the Dakota areas or states around there that would be for climate change and would talk about this? And this would be for more of people going, representing a reservation, a program person versus somebody that this is their technical expertise area, but they would be going to the workshop to learn about it more and then come back and start to work with partners to put stuff together. I noticed there were some trainings last year, but do you know of any scheduled ones coming up in the next few months?
I do not know of any, but I would suggest you contact Doug Cluck.
And I'm sorry, just repeat it one more time.
Sure, it's Doug, D-O-U-G, K-L-U-C-K, @NOAA.gov.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you, Dennis, very much for your briefing today, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.